The year was 1905, and the small mining town of Coal Hollow, nestled in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, was experiencing its golden age. The coal industry was booming, the railroads were expanding, and men from all walks of life flocked to the promise of steady work and decent pay. Among them were three friends who had become as close as brothers during their long hours beneath the earth's surface: Thomas Blackwell, Edward Harmon, and Samuel Thorne. Our story begins at dawn on a crisp autumn morning. The sky glowed amber as the sun peeked over the jagged mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the valley. Men gathered at the mine entrance, lunch pails in hand, faces still creased from sleep. The whistle blew, sharp and insistent, calling them to their daily descent. Thomas was always the first to arrive, a habit born from years of discipline as a foreman's son. At 42, his once auburn hair had begun to gray at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened from years of squinting in the dim light of the tunnels. He was respected among the men for his fair treatment and level head in emergencies. "Mornin', Tom," called a gruff voice as Edward approached, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel path. Edward was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with hands like shovels and a thick black beard that seemed to swallow his face. Despite his intimidating appearance, he was known for his hearty laugh and generosity. "Ed," Thomas nodded, lighting his pipe. "Samuel not here yet?" Edward chuckled, shaking his head. "You know Sam, probably saying goodbye to that wife of his for the 100th time. Man's been married 5 years and still acts like a lovesick pup." As if summoned by their conversation, Samuel appeared, hurrying toward them with a smile that seemed to brighten the early morning gloom. At 33, he was the youngest of the three, with boyish features, and an enthusiasm that had somehow survived years of backbreaking labor. "Sorry, boys," Samuel called, adjusting his cap. "Eliza made fresh biscuits this morning. Couldn't tear myself away." "One of these days, Thorne, you're gonna make us all late," Thomas said, though there was no real reproach in his voice. The three men joined the line of miners preparing to enter the shaft. They collected their safety lamps and tools before stepping into the cage that would lower them into the darkness below. The iron gates clanged shut, and with a jolt, they began their descent. The mine was a different world, a labyrinth of narrow tunnels where daylight never reached. The air was thick with coal dust that settled in the lungs and stained the skin. The only sounds were the distant tapping of pickaxes, the creak of support beams, and the occasional rumble that made every man's heart skip a beat. They worked their assigned section, falling into the familiar rhythm that came with years of practice. Thomas directed their efforts. Edward provided the strength, and Samuel, nimble and quick, navigated the tighter spaces. Hours passed in a blur of sweat and exertion. By midday, they paused to rest and eat. Sitting on overturned buckets in a small alcove, they opened their lunch pails by the flickering light of their lamps. "Did you hear about Jenkins?" Edward asked, tearing into a thick sandwich. Thomas nodded solemnly. "Pneumonia, wasn't it? 4th one this year," Samuel added. "Eliza's been boiling eucalyptus leaves to keep the cough away. Says her grandmother swore by it." "You're Eliza and her remedies," Edward chuckled. "Next, she'll have you wearing a rabbit's foot around your neck." "Laugh all you want," Samuel retorted, "but I haven't had so much as a sniffle since winter." Thomas smiled, watching his friends banter. These moments of levity were precious in the grim reality of their profession. Life expectancy for miners wasn't long. Cave-ins, explosions, lung disease, death lurked around every corner. Yet here they were, sharing jokes as if they were immortal. Edward was in the middle of a particularly colorful story about his encounter with the new shopkeeper's daughter, when a distant rumble interrupted him. The three men fell silent, exchanging wary glances. The rumble grew louder, and dust began to rain down from the ceiling. "Cave-in," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing roar. They scrambled to their feet, abandoning their lunch pails. Thomas took the lead, guiding them toward the main shaft. The tunnel seemed to shift and groan around them as they ran, their lamps casting wild, dancing shadows on the walls. The rumbling intensified, and suddenly, with a deafening crack, the ceiling collapsed just yards ahead of them, blocking their path to safety. They skidded to a halt, coughing as dust filled the air. "Back!" Thomas shouted. "We need to find another way out." They turned and fled in the opposite direction, deeper into the mine. The collapse continued behind them, a hungry beast devouring everything in its path. They darted down a side tunnel, one rarely used and poorly maintained, but it was their only option. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to crouch as they ran. Their breath came in ragged gasps, their hearts pounding against their ribs. Finally, the rumbling subsided, and they stopped to catch their breath. "Is everyone all right?" Thomas asked, raising his lamp to examine his companions. Edward nodded, his face pale beneath the coal dust. Samuel leaned against the wall, gasping for air, but gave a thumbs up. "Where are we?" Edward asked, peering into the darkness that stretched before them. Thomas frowned. "Old section, I think. They abandoned it years ago when the vein ran dry." Samuel straightened, his breathing steadier now. "So, how do we get out?" "If we keep heading east," Thomas said, pointing ahead, "we should eventually reach the secondary shaft. It's older, not used much these days, but it should still be intact." With no better options, they pressed forward. The tunnel was strange and unfamiliar, the walls rougher, the ceiling lower. Their lamps cast just enough light to see a few feet ahead, leaving the rest to shadow and imagination. As they walked, Samuel spoke up, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. "My grandfather used to tell stories about these old mines. Said they were dug before proper surveying, back when men just followed the coal wherever it led." "Your grandfather talk about anything else?" Edward asked, grateful for the distraction. "Like how to get out of a cursed mine alive." Samuel chuckled. "He also said these old tunnels sometimes broke into natural caverns, places no man was meant to see." "That's enough, Sam," Thomas cut in. "We need to focus on finding that shaft." They continued in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. The air grew colder and damper, and the tunnel widened into what appeared to be a small chamber. Thomas raised his lamp higher, revealing walls that glistened with moisture. "Wait," Edward said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "Do you hear that?" They listened. At first there was only silence, but then a faint sound like water dripping on stone. "There must be an underground spring nearby," Thomas reasoned. "That's good news. We can follow it to find a way out." But they moved toward the sound, which grew louder as they approached a narrow fissure in the wall. The opening was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. "I don't like this," Edward muttered, eyeing the crack skeptically. "Neither do I," Thomas admitted, "but we don't have much choice." One by one, they slipped through the fissure. Thomas went first, then Samuel, and finally Edward, who barely managed to force his broad shoulders through the narrow gap. On the other side, they found themselves in a vast cavern that took their breath away. Their lamps couldn't penetrate the darkness enough to see the ceiling or the far walls, but they illuminated enough to reveal that they stood on a narrow ledge above a pool of black water. The dripping sound echoed throughout the space, creating an eerie rhythmic melody. "Lord Almighty," Edward whispered, his voice bouncing back at them from unseen walls. Thomas peered around, trying to get his bearings. "We need to find a way around this pool." They edged along the narrow ledge, their backs pressed against the damp stone wall. The path curved gradually, following the contour of the pool. After what felt like an eternity, the ledge widened into a flat area large enough for them to stand comfortably. Samuel, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly exclaimed, "Look there!" His lamp illuminated something embedded in the wall ahead of them, something that gleamed dully in the light. They approached cautiously, and as they drew closer, they saw that it was a vein of metal running through the rock. "Is that gold?" Edward asked, his voice hushed with awe. Thomas stepped closer, examining the vein with a critical eye. "No, not gold. Silver, maybe." Samuel reached out to touch it, his fingers tracing the metallic streak. "Whatever it is, it's not coal. Do you think anyone knows this is here?" "Not likely," Thomas replied. "This area has been abandoned for decades." Edward grinned, his teeth flashing white against his dust-covered face. "Well, boys, seems our bad luck just turned. If we make it out of here, we could stake a claim. Split it 3 ways. The possibility of wealth, of escaping the dangerous life of coal mining, hung in the air between them, almost tangible in its allure. For a moment, they forgot their predicament, lost in visions of a better future. Samuel's laugh broke the spell, a sound of pure joy that echoed around the cavern. "Can you imagine? Eliza's always wanted a proper house with a garden, and little James could go to school instead of ending up down here like his pa." Edward joined in the laughter, clapping Samuel on the back. "I'd buy the biggest plot of land you ever saw, build a house with more rooms than I'd know what to do with." Even Thomas allowed himself a smile, caught up in the sudden hope. "Let's not count our fortunes yet. First, we need to find a way out." Still, the discovery had lifted their spirits. and they continued their journey with renewed determination. The ledge led them to another tunnel, smaller than the ones they were used to, but large enough to walk through comfortably. As they progressed, the tunnel began to slope upward, a promising sign. The air seemed fresher too, suggesting they might be approaching the surface. They quickened their pace, eager to escape the oppressive darkness. The tunnel eventually opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadows. Their lamps revealed a disturbing sight: the skeletal remains of what appeared to be an old mining operation. Rotting timbers, rusted tools, and the fragmented remnants of a wooden track lay scattered across the floor. "This must be from the early days," Thomas said, examining a primitive pickaxe. "Before the company took over." Edward nodded. "My pa talked about the first miners here. Said they were a desperate lot, working with whatever tools they could fashion." Samuel wandered a short distance away, his lamp swinging as he investigated their surroundings. Suddenly he called out, his voice tight with excitement or fear. They couldn't tell which. "Tom, Ed, you need to see this." They hurried over to where Samuel stood, frozen, his lamp held high. The light fell on a sight that made them all stop in their tracks. Against the far wall of the chamber was a crude wooden table, and seated around it were 3 figures. At first glance they appeared to be miners, caught in the middle of a meal or a card game. But as Thomas raised his own lamp for a better look, he realized with horror that what they were seeing were not men, but corpses, or rather, what remained of them. The bodies had mummified in the dry, cool air of the chamber, their skin stretched tight over bone, their clothes rotting off their desiccated frames. "Sweet Jesus," Edward breathed, making the sign of the cross. The 3 dead miners sat in poses suggesting they had been caught unawares. One had a tin cup still clutched in its bony fingers. Another had its head tilted back, as if frozen in the act of laughing. And the third, the one in the middle, had its mouth open in what might have been a smile or a grimace, revealing a set of teeth that seemed to gleam unnaturally in the lamplight. Thomas took a step closer, drawn by a morbid curiosity he couldn't suppress. The middle miner's teeth were wrong. Instead of the yellowed, often missing teeth common among men of their profession, this corpse's mouth was filled with what looked like metal, not gold or silver, but something darker, with an almost bluish tint. "What in God's name?" Thomas muttered, leaning in for a closer look. "Don't touch it," Samuel hissed, grabbing Thomas's arm. "We should leave them be." Edward, normally the bravest of the 3, had backed away, his face ashen. "Those men, they've been dead for decades. Why haven't they, rotted away?" Thomas shook his head, unable to tear his gaze from the middle miner's metallic grin. "The air down here must have preserved them somehow." Samuel tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Please, let's go. This place isn't right." Finally, Thomas nodded and turned away from the grim tableau. They quickly searched the chamber for an exit, desperate to leave the macabre scene behind. They found a tunnel on the opposite side and practically ran into it, not caring where it led as long as it was away from those lifeless grins. The new tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes widening, sometimes narrowing to the point where Edward had to turn sideways to squeeze through. Just when they began to fear they were hopelessly lost, they spotted a faint glow ahead, daylight filtering down from above. They emerged from the tunnel into a shallow depression in the mountainside, hidden by thick underbrush and fallen rocks. The late afternoon sun seemed blindingly bright after their hours in darkness, and they stood blinking, breathing deeply of the fresh air. "We made it," Edward said, his voice thick with relief. Thomas nodded, squinting at their surroundings, trying to get his bearings. "Looks like we're on the north side of the mountain. If we head west, we should reach the main road by nightfall." Samuel was oddly quiet, his face troubled despite their escape. "Those miners back there, what do you think happened to them?" Edward shrugged, already beginning to climb out of the depression. "Cave-in, probably. Same thing that almost got us. They weren't as lucky. But those teeth," Samuel persisted. "Did you see them? On the middle one?" "I saw," Thomas said grimly. "Never seen anything like it before." They fell silent as they made their way through the forest, each man lost in his own thoughts. The image of those 3 dead miners, preserved like grotesque dolls, haunted them, especially the middle one, with its unnatural metal smile. By the time they reached the main road, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. They were exhausted, filthy and shaken, but alive. A passing wagon gave them a ride back to town, where their unexpected appearance caused quite a stir. The story of their survival spread quickly through Coal Hollow, though they said nothing about the silver vein or the dead miners. Some things, they silently agreed, were better left unspoken. They reported the cave-in to the mine owner, who promised to send men to clear the debris and reopen the tunnels as soon as possible. Life should have returned to normal after that. But for Thomas, Edward, and Samuel, something had changed. The memory of what they had seen in that hidden chamber lingered, tainting even the simple pleasure of their evening gatherings at the local saloon. A week after their ordeal, Thomas was at home when there was a frantic knocking at his door. He opened it to find Eliza, Samuel's wife, her face streaked with tears. "It's Samuel," she sobbed. "Something's wrong with him. He's burning up with fever, and he's saying strange things, talking about teeth and silver and men who don't die." Thomas grabbed his coat and followed her to the small cabin where Samuel and his family lived. Inside, he found his friend thrashing on the bed, his face flushed, his eyes wild. Edward was already there, looking helpless and frightened. "He's been like this since this morning," Edward explained. "Doctor says it's just a fever, but..." Samuel's eyes suddenly focused on Thomas, and he reached out a trembling hand. "Tom, they're coming for us. The men from the chamber. They know we found it." Thomas took Samuel's hand, alarmed by how hot his skin felt. "Found what, Sam?" "The silver." Samuel shook his head violently. "Not silver. Something else. Something older. It was in their teeth, Tom. In their blood. And now it's in mine." A chill ran down Thomas's spine, but he forced a reassuring smile. "You're sick, Sam. That's all. You need to rest." But Samuel wouldn't be calmed. He clutched at Thomas's sleeve, his eyes wide with terror. "Look at my teeth, Tom. Look!" Against his better judgment, Thomas leaned closer as Samuel opened his mouth. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Just Samuel's familiar teeth, perhaps a bit more yellow than they had been. But then, as Samuel continued to stare at him imploringly, Thomas noticed something strange. A dark discoloration on one of Samuel's molars, a bluish-black spot that seemed to be spreading even as he watched. Thomas recoiled, blinking rapidly. When he looked again, Samuel's teeth appeared normal. Had he imagined it? "It's just the fever," Edward said firmly, though Thomas hadn't spoken aloud. "He'll be fine once it breaks." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He stayed for a while longer, helping Eliza apply cold compresses to Samuel's forehead, but his mind was racing. The image of the middle miner's metallic grin kept flashing before his eyes, interspersed with the glimpse of darkness he'd seen in Samuel's mouth. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He paced his small cabin, smoking pipe after pipe until the air was thick with the sweet scent of tobacco. Around midnight, he gave up and put on his coat. He needed to talk to Edward. The streets of Coal Hollow were deserted at this hour, lit only by the occasional gas lamp that cast more shadows than light. Thomas made his way to Edward's lodgings, a room above the general store. He was about to knock when he heard voices inside, Edward's deep rumble and another unfamiliar voice that spoke too quietly for Thomas to make out the words. Curiosity overcoming his manners, Thomas pressed his ear to the door. "Can't ignore it," Edward was saying, his tone urgent. "You saw what happened to Samuel. It's spreading," the other voice responded, too low to hear clearly, but Thomas caught fragments. "Warned you, and price to pay." Thomas knocked, unable to contain himself any longer. The voices inside fell silent immediately. After a long pause, he heard heavy footsteps approaching the door, which opened just enough for Edward to peer out. "Tom," Edward said, his face betraying surprise and something else. "Fear? What are you doing here so late?" "I needed to talk to you," Thomas replied, trying to see past Edward into the room. "About Samuel. Who's in there with you?" Edward stepped into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him. "No one. Just talking to myself. Bad habit, I know." Thomas frowned, certain he had heard two distinct voices. "Ed, don't lie to me. What's going on?" Edward sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. In the dim light of the hallway, he looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper. "It's complicated, Tom, and dangerous. The less you know, the better. Samuel is my friend, too," Thomas insisted. "If he's in danger, I need to know why." Edward hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Not here. Meet me at the old church ruins tomorrow at dawn. I'll explain everything then." Before Thomas could argue, Edward retreated into his room and shut the door firmly. Thomas stood there for a moment, frustration and concern warring within him. Finally, He turned and headed back into the night, more troubled than before. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the ruins of St. Mary's Church just as the first light of dawn painted the sky. The church had burned down years ago, leaving only stone walls and the skeletal remains of its once proud bell tower. Nature had begun to reclaim it, with vines crawling up the charred stones and wildflowers pushing through cracks in the floor. Edward was already there, sitting on a fallen column, his broad shoulders hunched. He looked up as Thomas approached, his expression grim. "You came alone?" Edward asked. Thomas nodded. "As you asked. Now, tell me what's happening to Samuel." Edward sighed, reaching into his pocket for his tobacco pouch. His hands trembled slightly as he rolled a cigarette. "It started a long time ago, before any of us were born. The original miners, the ones who first dug into these mountains, they found something. Not coal, not silver, something else." Thomas sat beside Edward, the cold stone seeping through his clothes. "What did they find?" "They never had a name for it," Edward said, lighting his cigarette. "A metal unlike any they'd seen before. It was in a vein deep in the mountain, but not like normal ore. It seemed almost alive. It moved through the rock like water or blood through veins." Thomas frowned. "That's impossible." "That's what they thought too," Edward continued, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "But they kept digging, kept following it. It made them rich. They could shape it, sell it as a new kind of steel, stronger, more flexible. But then they started to notice changes." "Changes?" Edward nodded solemnly. "It affected them. First their teeth, turned them metal, like what we saw in that chamber. Then their blood, their bones. They became something else. Not quite human anymore." Thomas stood abruptly, anger flaring. "This is nonsense, Ed. Metal doesn't turn men into monsters." "I know how it sounds," Edward said quietly. "But it's the truth. The company knew about it. Why do you think they closed off that section of the mine? Why do you think they tell us never to drink the water down there?" Thomas paced among the ruins, trying to process what he was hearing. "If this is true, why are you only telling me now? And what does it have to do with Samuel?" Edward took a long drag on his cigarette, his eyes following Thomas's movements. "Because I thought it was just stories, miners' superstitions. Until we found that chamber, saw those men. And now Samuel, he touched that vein, Tom. We all saw him do it. It's in him now, changing him. So what do we do?" Thomas demanded. "How do we help him?" Edward's expression darkened. "That's why I was talking to someone last night. There might be a way to stop it, to draw it out of him before it's too late." "Who are you talking to, Ed?" Edward avoided his gaze. "There are people in this town who know about the metal, who've been watching, keeping it contained. They've been here since the beginning." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Like a secret society?" "Something like that," Edward admitted. "My grandfather was one of them. That's how I know the stories. I never believed them, not really, until now." Thomas tried to make sense of it all. The dead miners, Samuel's illness, Edward's secret knowledge. It was too fantastic, too horrifying to accept. And yet, he couldn't deny what he had seen with his own eyes. "Take me to these people," he said finally. "If they can help Samuel, I want to meet them." Edward hesitated, then nodded. "Tonight, meet me at the cemetery gates at midnight. And Tom, come armed." The day passed in a haze of anxiety and disbelief. Thomas went through the motions of his normal routine, but his mind was elsewhere, grappling with Edward's revelations. He visited Samuel briefly, but his friend's condition had worsened. Samuel was delirious, his speech slurred, his skin hot to the touch. And when he smiled in a moment of lucidity, Thomas saw it clearly, a metallic sheen on his teeth that hadn't been there before. Eliza was beside herself with worry. "The doctor's been twice," she told Thomas in a hushed voice while Samuel dozed. "He says he's never seen anything like it. Suggests we prepare for the worst." Thomas reassured her as best he could, promising that help was coming. But as he left the cabin, he wondered if he was offering false hope. What if Edward's story was just that? A story, born of fear and superstition. What if there was no cure for whatever was consuming Samuel from within? As midnight approached, Thomas cleaned his revolver, checking and rechecking the chambers. He wasn't sure what he was preparing to face, but Edward's warning to come armed had left him deeply unsettled. The cemetery of Coal Hollow lay on a hill overlooking the town, a solemn collection of headstones and monuments that told the story of the community's hardships. Too many graves belonged to miners, men who had died young and violently. As Thomas approached the wrought iron gates, he wondered how many of those deaths had been caused by ordinary mining accidents, and how many might have been connected to the strange metal Edward had described. Edward was waiting, a dark silhouette against the moonlit gravestones. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a figure in a long coat, face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. "Tom," Edward called softly. "This is Dr. Holloway." The figure stepped forward, and in the pale moonlight, Thomas saw a woman's face, lined with age but sharp-eyed and intelligent. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried a leather doctor's bag. "Dr. Marion Holloway," she corrected, her voice crisp and authoritative. "You must be Thomas Blackwell. Edward has told me about your friend's condition." Thomas was taken aback. Female doctors were rare, especially in remote mining towns. "You're a medical doctor?" "Among other things," she replied enigmatically. "Edward tells me you've seen the Chamber of Three, and that your friend Samuel touched the vein." Thomas nodded, still processing her unexpected presence. "Can you help him?" Dr. Holloway's expression was grave. "Perhaps, if we act quickly. The contamination progresses faster in some than others." "Contamination? You make it sound like a disease." "In a way, it is," she said, opening the gate and gesturing for them to follow her into the cemetery. "The metal, we call it quicksilver, though it's not mercury. It seeks out life, changes it. The men you saw in that chamber were its first victims in this region." As they walked among the graves, Dr. Holloway continued her explanation. "My grandfather was the company doctor when the first miners encountered the quicksilver. He documented the changes they underwent. First the teeth, then the blood, then the bones, finally, the mind." "And there's a cure?" Thomas pressed. Dr. Holloway stopped before a large mausoleum, its stone facade decorated with strange symbols that Thomas didn't recognize. "Not a cure exactly, more of a containment. We can draw the quicksilver out, but there's a cost." "What kind of cost?" Thomas asked, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver in his coat pocket. Instead of answering, Dr. Holloway produced an old iron key and unlocked the mausoleum door. It swung open with a groan, revealing a staircase that led down into darkness. "The company built this place to study the quicksilver," she explained, lighting a lantern, "and to house those too far gone to save." Thomas exchanged a wary glance with Edward, who nodded encouragingly. Together they followed Dr. Holloway down the stairs, the temperature dropping with each step. The staircase seemed to go on forever, much deeper than any ordinary mausoleum should have reached. Finally, they emerged into a vast underground chamber that took Thomas's breath away. It was a laboratory of sorts, filled with strange equipment, glass containers, and bookshelves sagging under the weight of ancient-looking tomes. But what drew Thomas's attention was the center of the room, where a circular pit had been dug into the floor, lined with what appeared to be silver. "What is this place?" Thomas whispered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The Holloway Institute," Dr. Holloway replied, moving toward a workbench covered with papers. "My family has been studying the quicksilver for 3 generations, trying to understand its nature and counter its effects." Edward stepped closer to the pit, peering into its depths. "And this?" "The extraction chamber," she said matter-of-factly. "This is where we'll remove the quicksilver from your friend Samuel, if he consents." Thomas approached the pit cautiously. It was about 6 feet in diameter and descended into shadow, the silver lining catching the lantern light and reflecting it in hypnotic patterns. "How does it work?" he asked. Dr. Holloway began gathering various bottles and instruments from around the laboratory. "The quicksilver responds to certain frequencies, vibrations that draw it out of living tissue. The silver lining contains it, prevents it from seeking a new host." "And the cost you mentioned?" Thomas pressed, remembering her ominous words. Dr. Holloway paused in her preparations, fixing Thomas with a steady gaze. "The process is painful, extremely so, and it's not always successful. Sometimes, if the contamination has progressed too far, the extraction kills the host." "And if we do nothing?" Edward asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then Samuel will become like those miners you saw," she said grimly. "His body will change, harden, and his mind. The quicksilver has a consciousness of its own. It will subsume his, eventually." Thomas felt sick. The choice seemed impossible. Risk killing Samuel with this strange procedure, or watch him transform into something inhuman. "There's more," Dr. Holloway continued, her voice lowering. "The quicksilver is attracted to itself. Those 3 miners in the chamber, they're not dead, not truly. They're dormant, And now that the chamber has been opened, now that the Quicksilver has found a new host in Samuel, they may awaken. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. That's not possible. Those men had been there for decades. Time means nothing to the Quicksilver, she replied. It preserves its hosts, keeps them functional. Those miners could walk out of that chamber tomorrow, looking for Samuel, looking to reunite the scattered pieces of themselves. Edward, who had been silent for some time, suddenly spoke up. It's happening already. The mine owner sent men to clear the cave-in yesterday. They reported the chamber empty. The miners are gone. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Because I didn't want to believe it, Edward admitted. Didn't want to face what it meant. Dr. Holloway interrupted their exchange. We don't have time for this. If Samuel is already showing symptoms, the Quicksilver is taking hold quickly. We need to bring him here tonight. Thomas wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but the urgency in her voice was clear. All right, let's get Samuel. They left the mausoleum, locking the heavy door behind them, and made their way back to town. The streets were deserted at this late hour, the only light coming from the occasional gas lamp and the waning moon above. They moved quickly and quietly, Thomas leading the way to Samuel's cabin. When they arrived, they found the door ajar, a sliver of light spilling onto the porch. Thomas drew his revolver, a sense of dread growing in his chest. He pushed the door open slowly, calling out, Eliza? Samuel? The cabin was in disarray, furniture overturned, dishes shattered on the floor. Eliza lay unconscious by the hearth, a trickle of blood running from a cut on her forehead. Of Samuel there was no sign. Edward rushed to Eliza's side while Dr. Holloway examined her injury. She's alive, the doctor announced. Just knocked out. She'll have quite a headache, but she should be fine. Thomas searched the cabin, looking for clues to Samuel's whereabouts. In the bedroom, he found signs of a struggle. The bedsheets torn, a lamp broken on the floor, and on the wall, a strange smear that glistened in the light. Thomas touched it cautiously, finding it cool and slightly tacky, like partially dried blood, but it wasn't red. It was a deep, metallic blue-black. He's changing faster than I expected, Dr. Holloway said from the doorway, watching Thomas examine the substance. The Quicksilver is already altering his bodily fluids. But where would he go? Thomas asked, wiping his fingers on a handkerchief. Eliza's weak voice answered from the other room. The mine, he said. He had to go back to the mine. They returned to find Eliza sitting up, supported by Edward. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. 3 men came, she whispered. They looked like miners, but wrong. Their skin was like leather, and their eyes were empty. They took Samuel. He went willingly, like he knew them. Thomas and Edward exchanged grim looks. The miners from the chamber had come for Samuel, just as Dr. Holloway had warned. We need to go after them, Thomas said, checking his revolver again. Back to that chamber. Dr. Holloway shook her head. Not the chamber. They'll take him deeper to the source, to where the Quicksilver first broke through into this world. You know where that is? Edward asked. I have maps, she replied. My grandfather documented everything. But we'll need more than just the 3 of us. The Quicksilver entities are strong, nearly indestructible. Edward stood, his expression resolute. I know men we can trust. Miners who've heard the stories, who've seen strange things in the deep tunnels. Get them, Thomas ordered. Tell them to bring lanterns and weapons. We'll meet at the north entrance in an hour. While Edward went to gather reinforcements, Thomas helped Dr. Holloway tend to Eliza. The doctor gave her a sedative from her bag, explaining that it would help her rest and heal. Will Samuel, Eliza began, her voice breaking. Will he still be my Samuel when you find him? Thomas wanted to reassure her, to promise that everything would be all right, but he couldn't bring himself to offer false hope. We're going to do everything we can to bring him back, Eliza. I swear it. As Eliza drifted into a drugged sleep, Thomas turned to Dr. Holloway. You said the Quicksilver has a consciousness. What does it want? The doctor's face was grim in the lamplight. To spread, to transform. It's not from this world, Mr. Blackwell. It's something alien, something that fell from the stars centuries ago, buried deep until men with pickaxes and dynamite released it. And those miners in the chamber, its first apostles, she said softly, preserved to continue its work when the time was right. Your discovery of the chamber, Samuel's touch, it was the signal it had been waiting for. An hour later, Thomas, Edward, and Dr. Holloway met a group of 6 miners at the north entrance to the mine. These were hard men, veterans of the deep tunnels. who had seen enough strange things in their years underground to believe Edward's urgent warnings. They were armed with pickaxes, shovels, and a few revolvers. Each carried a safety lamp, and Dr. Holloway had brought additional equipment from her laboratory, strange devices that hummed and clicked, measuring invisible forces. "The quicksilver is sensitive to certain frequencies," she explained as they prepared to enter the mine. "These devices will help us track it and, if necessary, repel it temporarily." Thomas addressed the group, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We're going after Samuel Thorne. He's been taken by something dangerous. We need to bring him back alive if possible, but be prepared for anything. These creatures look like men, but they're not anymore." The miners nodded grimly, tightening their grips on their weapons. They understood the dangers of the mine better than most. The dark was their daily companion, the mountain their adversary and provider. Dr. Holloway unfolded a yellowed map on a flat rock, pointing to a section deep within the mountain. "This is where we need to go. The original breakthrough point, where the quicksilver was first discovered. It's far below the current workings, accessible only through the old tunnels." "Those tunnels collapsed years ago," one of the miners objected. "There's no way through." "There is now," Edward said. "The quicksilver entities cleared a path when they took Samuel. They're returning to their source." With that sobering thought, they entered the mine. The familiar route soon gave way to older tunnels, the supporting timbers rotted and sagging with age. They moved carefully, aware that a wrong step could trigger another collapse. They reached the site of the recent cave-in, now partially cleared by the company's workers. Beyond it lay the side tunnel Thomas, Edward, and Samuel had fled down during their escape, and further still, the chamber where they had discovered the three miners. The chamber was empty now, as Edward had reported. The crude table remained, but the grisly occupants were gone. Only a faint, metallic scent lingered in the air, like copper and ozone. Dr. Holloway consulted her map again, then pointed to a dark opening on the far side of the chamber. "Through there. It's a natural fissure that leads down to the old workings." Single file, they squeezed through the narrow passage, descending deeper into the mountain. The air grew warmer, more oppressive, and a strange blue luminescence began to appear on the walls, a faint pulsing glow that seemed to follow their movements. "Quicksilver residue," Dr. Holloway explained in a hushed voice. "It leaves traces, like a snail's trail. We're getting close." The passage eventually opened into a vast cavern, far larger than the one Thomas and his friends had discovered during their escape. Their lamps couldn't penetrate the darkness enough to see the ceiling, but they illuminated the cavern floor, which sloped down to a lake of what appeared to be liquid metal, a shifting, rippling pool that glowed with the same blue luminescence they had seen on the walls. And at the edge of that lake stood 4 figures. 3 were the miners from the chamber, their desiccated forms now animated, moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. The 4th was Samuel, or what Samuel was becoming. His skin had taken on a grayish hue, and when he turned to look at their approach, his eyes reflected the light like mirrors. "Tom," Samuel called, his voice strangely hollow. "You came. Good. You should join us. It's magnificent." Thomas stepped forward, his revolver trained on the 3 mummified miners. "We're here to take you home, Sam. Eliza's waiting for you." Samuel smiled, and Thomas had to suppress a shudder. His friend's teeth were now completely metallic, gleaming blue-black in the eerie light. "Eliza can join us too. All of Coal Hollow will join us eventually. The quicksilver has waited long enough." The 3 mummified miners moved to stand protectively around Samuel, their empty eye sockets somehow fixed on the rescue party. One of them opened its mouth, revealing the same metallic teeth that had horrified Thomas in the chamber, and spoke in a voice like grinding stones. "The vessel is accepting the gift. Do not interfere." Dr. Holloway stepped forward, holding up one of her strange devices, which emitted a high-pitched whine. The mummified miners recoiled slightly, their leathery faces contorting in what might have been pain. "Samuel Thorne," she called, her voice firm and commanding. "You are being consumed by an alien entity. Fight it. Remember who you are." Samuel's face flickered with emotion, confusion, pain, a moment of recognition, before settling back into an eerie calm. "I remember who I was. A man who spent his days in darkness, digging in the dirt for scraps. Now I'm becoming something more, something eternal." The miners behind Thomas shifted nervously, muttering among themselves. The sight of their transformed colleague, standing with the animated corpses, was testing even their hardened nerves. "What do we do?" Edward whispered to Dr. Holloway. "How do we save him?" The doctor adjusted her device, increasing the frequency. The whine became painful to human ears, and the mummified miners retreated further from the sound, dragging Samuel with them toward the edge of the Quicksilver Lake. "We need to separate him from the entities in the lake," she replied urgently. "The connection to the source is strengthening the Quicksilver in his system. If we can get him back to the extraction chamber, we might still have a chance." Thomas nodded, understanding the plan. He addressed the miners behind him. "We need to create a diversion. Keep those things occupied while we get to Samuel." The men nodded grimly, spreading out along the edge of the cavern, their weapons at the ready. On Thomas's signal, they began firing at the mummified miners, the shots echoing deafeningly in the enclosed space. The bullets seemed to have little effect, merely chipping away pieces of desiccated flesh to reveal a metallic skeleton beneath. But the attack served its purpose. The creatures turned their attention to the gunmen, moving with that same unnatural speed toward the threat. Thomas, Edward, and Dr. Holloway circled around, staying close to the cavern wall, trying to reach Samuel while the battle raged. Samuel watched the conflict with detached interest, making no move to flee or join in. As they drew closer, Thomas called out to his friend, "Sam, it's me, Tom. You need to come with us now." Samuel turned, his mirror-like eyes reflecting Thomas's desperate expression. For a moment, something human flickered in their depths. "Tom, something's wrong with me, isn't it?" "Yes," Thomas replied, hope surging. "But we can help you. Dr. Holloway knows how to remove it, the thing that's changing you." Samuel took a step toward them, then stopped, his body shuddering violently. "It doesn't want to let go," he gasped, his voice momentarily his own again. "It's in my head, Tom, telling me things, showing me things." "Fight it, Sam," Edward urged, moving closer. "Think of Eliza. Think of little James." At the mention of his family, Samuel's expression crumpled, a very human anguish breaking through the alien calm. "Eliza," he whispered. "Is she all right?" "I remember. They came to the cabin. She's fine," Thomas assured him, taking another cautious step forward. "She's waiting for you to come home." Samuel's internal struggle was visible, his body twitching, his face contorting as he fought against the entity attempting to control him. "Help me," he pleaded, reaching out a trembling hand. Thomas lunged forward, grabbing Samuel's outstretched hand. The contact sent a shock through his system. Samuel's skin was unnaturally cold, and Thomas could feel something moving beneath it, like liquid metal flowing through his veins. But he held on, pulling Samuel away from the Quicksilver Lake. Edward joined him, supporting Samuel from the other side as the man's legs gave way beneath him. The moment they began to retreat, the mummified miners broke off their attack on the gunmen and turned toward them, sensing the attempt to remove their new brother from the source. They moved with terrifying speed, covering ground in long, jerky strides that defied their desiccated appearance. "Run," Dr. Holloway shouted, adjusting her device to emit an even higher frequency. The sound was now almost unbearable to human ears, but it slowed the pursuing entities enough to give them a head start. The miners provided covering fire as Thomas and Edward half-carried, half-dragged Samuel toward the fissure through which they had entered. Dr. Holloway followed, periodically turning to use her device to keep the mummified miners at bay. The retreat through the narrow passage was agonizingly slow. Samuel was barely conscious, his body increasingly heavy and rigid, as if the metal in his system was solidifying. By the time they emerged into the chamber of the three miners, Thomas and Edward were gasping with exertion. "We need to get him to the extraction chamber," Dr. Holloway reminded them, glancing nervously at the passage behind them. The miners who had provided their diversion were following, firing occasional shots to slow the pursuing entities. "He's too heavy," Edward grunted, adjusting his grip on Samuel's arm, "and getting heavier by the minute." Dr. Holloway reached into her bag and produced a syringe filled with a silvery liquid. "This will slow the transformation temporarily. It won't stop it, but it should buy us enough time to reach the mausoleum." She injected the substance into Samuel's neck, and almost immediately, his body seemed to relax, becoming more pliable. His eyes fluttered open, more human than metallic for the moment. "Tom," he murmured, "what's happening to me?" "We're going to fix you, Sam," Thomas promised, helping his friend to his feet. "Just stay with us a little longer." The journey back through the mine was a blur of darkness, echoing footsteps and constant fear of pursuit. The miners who had accompanied them took turns carrying Samuel when Thomas and Edward's strength began to fail. Dr. Holloway led the way, her strange devices periodically emitting pulses that she claimed would mask their trail from the Quicksilver entities. By the time they emerged from the mine, dawn was breaking, the sky lightening to a pale gray. They had lost 2 men in the retreat, one to a tunnel collapse triggered by a mummified miner, another to a mysterious seizure after touching one of the metallic creatures. They loaded Samuel into a wagon borrowed from a bewildered farmer and made their way to the cemetery as quickly as possible. Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and afraid, other times raving about the gift and the transformation. His skin had taken on a metallic sheen, and blue-black veins were visible beneath the surface, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. At the cemetery, Dr. Holloway unlocked the mausoleum and directed them to carry Samuel down to the laboratory. The extraction chamber was prepared, the silver lining polished to a mirror shine, strange devices positioned around its circumference. "Place him in the center," she instructed, moving quickly around the laboratory, gathering bottles and instruments. "And then you'll need to restrain him. The Quicksilver will fight the extraction process." Thomas and Edward gently lowered Samuel into the pit, where he lay motionless, his breathing shallow. Dr. Holloway provided thick leather straps, which they reluctantly used to secure Samuel's arms and legs to metal rings embedded in the floor of the pit. "What now?" Thomas asked, climbing out of the pit, his heart heavy at the sight of his friend bound like an animal. "Now we begin the extraction," Dr. Holloway replied, adjusting various dials and switches on her equipment. "It will be unpleasant. You may want to wait upstairs." Thomas shook his head firmly. "I'm staying with him." "Same here," Edward added, his expression resolute. Dr. Holloway nodded, understanding. "Very well, but do not interfere, no matter what happens. The process must run its course." She activated her equipment, which began to emit a series of tones, not the painful whine they had used to repel the mummified miners, but a more complex sequence of sounds that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. Samuel's body tensed at the first note, his back arching against the restraints. As the sequence continued, he began to thrash, his face contorted in agony, though no sound escaped his lips. Thomas took an involuntary step forward, but Edward's hand on his arm stopped him. "We have to let it happen," Edward reminded him, his voice tight with shared pain. The tones increased in intensity, and Samuel's struggles became more violent. And then, something extraordinary began to happen. A blue-black liquid started to seep from his pores, his eyes, his mouth, the Quicksilver, being drawn out of his body by the sonic frequencies. The liquid didn't fall to the floor of the pit, but hovered in the air above Samuel, forming into pulsing metallic droplets that slowly coalesced into a sphere. The silver lining of the pit seemed to attract the substance, preventing it from escaping or returning to its host. Samuel's screams finally broke through, raw and agonized, the sound of a man being torn apart from the inside. Thomas had to turn away, unable to watch his friend's suffering, while Edward stood rigid, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. The process seemed to last forever, though Dr. Holloway later told them it was just under an hour. Finally, the last of the Quicksilver was extracted, forming a perfect sphere about the size of a man's fist, hovering above Samuel's now still form. Dr. Holloway quickly moved forward with a silver container, capturing the sphere before it could escape. She sealed the container with practiced efficiency, muttering what sounded like a prayer or incantation as she did so. Thomas and Edward rushed to Samuel's side. He lay unconscious, his skin pale but human again. No sign of the metallic transformation that had been consuming him. His breathing was shallow but regular, and when Thomas checked his pulse, it was weak but steady. "Will he recover?" Thomas asked, looking up at Dr. Holloway. She approached, examining Samuel with a critical eye. "Physically, yes, though it will take time. The Quicksilver caused significant changes to his system that will need to heal. Mentally," she hesitated. "That's harder to predict. He's been touched by something alien, something that tried to subsume his consciousness. There may be lingering effects." They carried Samuel upstairs and transferred him to a wagon for the journey back to town. The surviving miners dispersed to their homes, sworn to secrecy about the night's events. Thomas suspected that their stories would eventually become part of the mine's folklore. Whispered warnings passed from veteran to newcomer, Dr. Holloway accompanied them to Samuel's cabin, where a tearful Eliza was waiting. The doctor explained that Samuel had contracted a rare disease in the mine but had been treated successfully. She provided medicine, normal, human medicine, to help with his recovery and promised to check on him regularly. As they left Samuel in Eliza's care, Thomas pulled Dr. Holloway aside. "What about the entities? The mummified miners? Will they come for him again?" The doctor's expression was grave. "They'll try. The Quicksilver seeks to be whole again. But without the portion that was in Samuel, they're weakened, less focused. We have time to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "For what comes next," she replied simply. "The Quicksilver has awakened. It won't stop with one man, one town. It wants to spread, to transform everything it touches. This is just the beginning." In the days that followed, Samuel slowly recovered his strength. He remembered little of his ordeal, which Dr. Holloway assured them was a blessing. The gaps in his memory were filled with a carefully constructed story about a cave-in and a mining accident. But there were moments, brief, troubling moments, when Thomas would catch Samuel staring into the distance, his expression vacant, his fingers unconsciously touching his teeth, and sometimes, in the right light, Thomas thought he could still see a faint metallic gleam in his friend's eyes. The town of Coal Hollow continued its daily rhythms, unaware of the danger that had emerged from the depths beneath it. The mine reopened. Men descended into the darkness to extract coal. Life went on. Thomas and Edward kept their vigil, watching for signs of the mummified miners, for any indication that the Quicksilver was making another attempt to spread. Dr. Holloway trained them in the use of her devices, taught them the signs to look for, prepared them for the battle she believed was coming. And deep in the mountain, in the cavern with the lake of living metal, the three miners waited, their metallic bones gleaming in the blue luminescence, their empty eye sockets fixed on the tunnel that led to the world above. Patient, timeless, they stood guard over the Quicksilver, waiting for the moment when it would rise again, when it would flow through the veins of the mountain and into the unsuspecting town. Thomas knew they were there. In his dreams, he could see them, could feel their alien consciousness reaching out, searching. They had lost a part of themselves when Samuel was saved, and they wanted it back. But more than that, they wanted new vessels, new apostles to spread their gift. 1 month after their ordeal, Thomas found Edward at the saloon, nursing a whiskey with a troubled expression. "They found another vein," Edward said without preamble. "West Tunnel, deep section, blue-black metal, like nothing they've seen before." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Did anyone touch it?" Edward nodded grimly. "Jenkins. He's already showing signs. Teeth first, just like Samuel." Thomas signaled for a whiskey of his own, suddenly needing its burning comfort. "So it begins again." "It never ended," Edward replied, his voice hollow. "It was just waiting." As they sat in somber silence, a group of miners at a nearby table erupted in laughter, a simple human moment of joy in a hard life. Thomas turned to look at them, these men who had no idea of the horror that lurked beneath their feet, that threatened to transform them into something other than human. And then he saw it, a flash of metal in one man's smile as he laughed, just a glimpse, but unmistakable to eyes that knew what to look for. Thomas nudged Edward, who followed his gaze and saw it too. The man, Thomas didn't know his name, was new to the mine, had only been in Coal Hollow for a few weeks. He laughed again at something his companion said, and this time there was no mistaking it. His teeth had begun to change, to take on that distinctive blue-black metallic sheen. The transformation had begun again. The Quicksilver was spreading, and as Thomas met the miner's gaze across the room, he saw recognition there, not of Thomas himself, but of what Thomas knew. The man's smile widened, revealing more of those unnatural teeth, and he raised his glass in a mocking toast. Thomas and Edward exchanged a grim look. The battle for Coal Hollow, for humanity itself, was just beginning, and the enemy was already among them, wearing friendly faces and familiar smiles, hiding its true nature behind laughter and camaraderie. The three miners in the photograph, captured in a moment of shared joy, told a story that few would understand. But those who knew what to look for, who studied the middle one's teeth with knowledgeable eyes, would see the truth. The Quicksilver's first emergence, its first human apostles, the beginning of a transformation that threatened to consume them all. And now, decades later, it was happening again. The cycle continuing, the metal awakening, seeking new vessels for its alien consciousness. Thomas finished his whiskey and stood, ready to face whatever came next, for he had seen the truth behind the laughter, had glimpsed the horror hidden in a smile, and could never again look at the world, or his fellow man, the same way. "Let's go," he said to Edward, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "We have work to do." As they left the saloon, Thomas cast one last glance at the miner with the metallic smile. The man was still watching him, still grinning that unnatural grin, and as their eyes met, Thomas saw something shift in the man's gaze, something inhuman looking out from behind a human mask. The battle for Coal Hollow had begun, and the enemy was smiling.